Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Stotasa Shri Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai ISKCON BBT Founder Acharya His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai Prem se kaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Shri Sri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shama Kund Radha Kund Giri Govardhan Ki Jai Braj Bhumi Vrindavan Dhama Ki Jai Navadvip Mayapur Dhama Ki Jai Jagannath Puri Dhama Ki Jai Gangamayi Ki Jai Yamunamayi Ki Jai Bhakti Devi Ki Jai Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Go Premanande. Oh glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. Oh glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. Oh glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. Oh glories to Shri Shri Guru Chittana. Oh glories to Shri Prabhupada. Hare Krishna. So welcome to today's class of Bhagavad Gita in English. We're reading from chapter number 5, entitled Karma Yoga, Action in Krishna Consciousness, and sloka number 7. Yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā kurvan api na lipyate yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā kurvan api na lipyate yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā kurvan api na lipyate yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā kurvan api na lipyate yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā kurvan api na lipyate yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā kurvan api na lipyate yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā kurvan api na lipyate. Vaishnavis. Yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā kurvan api na lipyate yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā kurvan api na lipyate. Yoga-yuktaḥ, engaged in devotional service. Viśuddha-ātmā, a purified soul. vijita-ātmā, self-controlled, jita-indriyaḥ, having controlled the senses, sarva-bhūta, to all living entities, ātma-bhūta-ātmā, compassionate, kurvan api, although engaged in work, na, never, lipyate, is entangled. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. One who works in devotion, who is a pure soul, and who controls his mind and senses, is dear to everyone, and everyone is dear to him. Although always working, such a man is never entangled. Please repeat. One who works in devotion, who is a pure soul, and who controls his mind and senses, is dear to everyone, and everyone is dear to him. Though always working, such a man is never entangled. Purport. One who is on the path of liberation by Kṛṣṇa consciousness is very dear to every living being, and every living being is dear to him. This is due to his Kṛṣṇa consciousness. Such a person cannot think of any living being as separate from Kṛṣṇa, just as the leaves and branches of a tree are not separate from the tree. He knows very well that by pouring water on the root of the tree, the water will be distributed to all the leaves and branches. Or by supplying food to the stomach, the energy is automatically distributed throughout the body. Because one who works in Kṛṣṇa consciousness is a servant to all, he is very dear to everyone. And because everyone is satisfied by his work, he is pure in consciousness. Because he is pure in consciousness, his mind is completely controlled. And because his mind is controlled, his senses are also controlled. Because his mind is always fixed on Kṛṣṇa, there is no chance of his being deviated from Kṛṣṇa. Nor is there a chance that he will engage his senses in matters other than the service of the Lord. He does not like to hear anything except topics relating to Kṛṣṇa. He does not like to eat anything which is not offered to Kṛṣṇa, and he does not wish to go anywhere if Kṛṣṇa is not involved. Therefore, his senses are controlled. A man of controlled senses cannot be offensive to anyone. One may ask, why then was Arjuna offensive in battle to others? Wasn't he in Kṛṣṇa consciousness? Arjuna was only superficially offensive because, as has already been explained in the second chapter, all the assembled persons on the battlefield would continue to live individually as the soul cannot be slain. So spiritually, no one was killed on the battlefield of Kurukṣetra. Only the addresses were changed by the order of Kṛṣṇa, who was personally present. Therefore, Arjuna, while fighting on the battlefield of Kurukṣetra, was not really fighting at all. He was simply carrying out the orders of Kṛṣṇa in full Kṛṣṇa consciousness. Such a person is never entangled in the reactions of work. Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmalitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Sayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandayaham Sri Guru Sri Yuta Padakamalam Sri Guru Vaishnavamscha Sri Rupam Sakrijatam Sakrijatam Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Sri Visakanvitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namustate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vansha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesa Shunyavadi Paschachadeshatarane Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasari Gauravakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Yoga-yukto viśuddha-ātmā, vijita-ātmā jitendriyaḥ, sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā, kurvan api na lipyate. One who works in devotion, who is a pure soul, and who controls his mind and senses, is dear to everyone, and everyone is dear to him. Though always working, such a man is never entangled. So Prabhupada is very elaborately explaining the meaning of these terms in the purport and how one follows on to the other. These terms, yoga-yukto, engaged in devotional service. Viśuddha-ātmā, a purified soul. Vijita-ātmā, self-controlled. Jita-indriyaḥ, having conquered the senses. So he's compassionate to all living entities. And therefore he is very dear to every living being. And every living being is dear to him. So Srila Prabhupada gives the example how a person in Krishna consciousness cannot think of anyone as being separate from Krishna, as the leaves are not separate from the tree. And thus we can, Prabhupada gives the example of watering the root of the tree. But Prabhupada also says that such a person is the servant of all living entities because of his being in Krishna consciousness. Because when we see that every living entity is equally part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, then we want to serve them and help them. This is our preaching movement. We want to preach to reintroduce those who have forgotten Krishna. So when we are in devotional service to Krishna, naturally we're kind to every living entity. So in this way, we're actually, as when we feed the water to the root of the tree, the water gets distributed everywhere. And as we serve Krishna, that service gets distributed everywhere as well. Prabhupada says in a progression, he says, one who works in Krishna consciousness is a servant to all. Therefore he is very dear. Because everyone likes him, his consciousness is purified. Because his consciousness is purified, his mind is controlled. Because his mind is controlled, his senses are also controlled. So when our mind becomes controlled, then we don't want to do anything that's not pleasing to Krishna. Prabhupada gives a very nice example. He will not want to engage his senses in anything other than topics of Kṛṣṇa. He will not want to hear anything that's not about Kṛṣṇa. He will not want to eat anything that is not offered to Kṛṣṇa, and he doesn't want to go anywhere if Kṛṣṇa is not involved. Thus, automatically the senses are controlled. So in this part of the chapter, what's being discussed is how to practice Nishkaram karma yoga. That means acting in Kṛṣṇa consciousness, and it means Nishkam means without desires for personal achievement. So karma yoga means acting in devotional service for Kṛṣṇa, and it has two varieties. It can be sakam or it can be nishkam. So sakam karma yoga is when we take up devotional service but we have goals of our own. And most of us in the beginning of devotional service have some goals, even if it's to purify our consciousness. Because when we come to Kṛṣṇa consciousness, we understand that we're not pure and we need to purify our consciousness. So we have that much of a desire in Kṛṣṇa consciousness. Sometimes in Kṛṣṇa consciousness, we're doing these activities because we're ordered to by the spiritual master. And sometimes we're doing for other reasons, because because we feel happy in Kṛṣṇa consciousness, because it makes us peaceful. So many different motivations are there, which are perfectly natural in the beginning stages of Kṛṣṇa consciousness. But ultimately we'll become purified, and we will want to just serve Kṛṣṇa. So Prabhupada paraphrases one verse earlier in the Bhagavad Gita, which is 2:12. Na tvevaham jatu nasam, na tvam neme janadibaha, na chaiva na vivishyamaha, sarva-vayam ataparam. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall we cease to be. So right in the beginning, Prabhupada says, he says that he paraphrases this verse, and he does that for a specific reason, because Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains that the Mayavadis take this sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā. So Prabhupada's clearly described it in the word for word, sarva-bhūta, to all living entities, ātma-bhūta-ātmā, compassionate. But the Mayavadis have another reason, have another explanation. When the Mayavadis take this phrase, they want it to mean that a living entity is the soul of all other living entities. It means they're trying to equate themselves with the super soul. So therefore Prabhupada very clearly says that Kṛṣṇa is not saying that, because Kṛṣṇa uses these three other words which clearly show that he's not talking about a human being being the same as the super soul. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains that viśuddha-ātmā, which means the purified soul, vijita-ātmā, one who is self-controlled, and jitendriyaḥ, one who has conquered his senses. These are clearly defining the individual soul and not the super soul. One who possesses these qualities has not become one with everyone, but he feels that everyone is dear to him. So this chapter begins by Arjuna being confused. He's confused because in the 4th chapter, Kṛṣṇa had explained about knowledge in Kṛṣṇa consciousness and saying that knowledge was the highest goal. But then he finished that chapter by asking Arjuna to fight. He said, Tasmad ajnana sambhutam hridstam jnana sinatmanaha chitvainam samshayam yogam atishto bharata. Therefore, the doubts which have arisen in your heart out of ignorance should be slashed by the weapon of knowledge. Armed with yoga, O Bharata, stand and fight. So Kṛṣṇa had clearly asked Arjuna to stand and fight, to actually act. So now Arjuna, Bodhidharma Prabhu in his commentary is explaining that actually this confusion of Arjuna is for our benefit, because Kṛṣṇa wants to further explain action in Krishna consciousness, or unattached action. So therefore Arjuna seems to be still bewildered about what Kṛṣṇa has explained. So Kṛṣṇa is very clearly saying that renunciation of work and work and devotion are both good for liberation, but of the two, work and devotional service is better than renunciation of work. But still this work and devotional service comes back to knowledge, as we'll find out at the end of the chapter. Bhaktaram yagyatapasam sarva-loka maheshram suhridam sarva-bhūtānam gyatva mam shantim richyate. A person in full consciousness of me, knowing me to be the ultimate beneficiary of all sacrifices and austerities, the Supreme Lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, attains peace from the pangs of material knowledge. So Kṛṣṇa is concluding the chapter by coming back to knowledge. We have to know these things. So there are two types of knowledge. It's described in the 7th chapter, how there's knowledge about Kṛṣṇa in Krishna consciousness, and there is knowledge that is material and not useful. 1560. So the material knowledge is described in 7th chapter and 15th verse, where Kṛṣṇa talks about 4 types of people who will never surrender to him. He says, Na mam duskrino mudha prapajante naradamaha mayaya pahrita jnana asuram bhavim asritaha. So he talks about mayaya pahrita jnana. So this is a knowledge that we don't want, the knowledge that has been stolen by illusion. So this is the Mayavadis. They are very attached to knowledge, and they study and study and study, but they never come up with a conclusion because they're relying so much on their own intelligence to come to the conclusion. Prabhupada describes these Mayaya Pahrita Jnanas, persons whose erudite knowledge has been nullified by the illusory energy, like scientists and philosophers, and Mayavadis who try and comment on the Bhagavad Gita, but actually who have no knowledge of what the conclusion of the Bhagavad Gita is. And in the very next verse, Kṛṣṇa talks about 4 kinds of people who surrender to him, and a jnani is also there. Chatur vida bhijanti mam jana sukritno arjuna atarto jikyasu artarti jnani cha bharatarshava. So again, there is a jnani. There is a jnani in the type of people who surrender to Kṛṣṇa. Kṛṣṇa said, 4 kinds of pious men begin to render devotional service unto me: the distressed, the desire of wealth, the inquisitive, and he who is searching for knowledge of the Absolute. And in the next verse, Kṛṣṇa says, of these, the one who is in full knowledge and who is always engaged in devotional service is the best. For I am very dear to him, and he is dear to me. So this jnani is the jnani that we're talking about at the end of the 5th chapter. The jnani who knows Kṛṣṇa, who knows the living entity, and who knows what the material nature is. So we become the servant of Kṛṣṇa. We are actually described by Burijan in his commentary, we find out that we're actually part and parcel of Kṛṣṇa, and that we're not part and parcel of Maya. So this gyan, this knowledge that relates to devotional service, will strengthen our devotion. And the other thing that knowledge does is it strengthens detachment. So as we go on in the chapter, it's more and more described how this control of the senses is an important part of Nishkaram Karma Yoga. And Kṛṣṇa goes on to explain that a person who is in this position of Nishkaram Karma Yoga, he, in the next two verses, which are a couple verse, a person in the divine consciousness, and though engaged in seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating and moving around, sleeping and breathing, knows within himself that he actually does nothing at all. Because while speaking, evacuating, receiving and opening and closing his eyes, he always knows that only the material senses are engaged with their objects, and he is aloof from them. So this will tend us to think that we're not doing anything, we're not responsible for what we do. But Kṛṣṇa goes on to explain that although we're not the doer, by our desire we cause action to be done. So it's described elsewhere in the Bhagavad Gita, the different doers, and it's described again here. Kṛṣṇa initially talks about the first doer, which is the individual soul. The senses are the ones who do the work, but we instigate that by our desires. And Kṛṣṇa gives the example of how a person who is not attached to the senses is like a lotus leaf in the water. The water never sticks to it, even though it's in the water. But still we're acting. The yogis, abandoning attachment, act with body, mind and intelligence, and even the senses, for the purpose of purification. So this comes back to this viśuddha-ātmā in this verse, how we want our consciousness to become purified. Now, Burijan Prabhu gives a nice example of how, although we're not the doer in the sense that the senses are doing things, we're the doer in the sense that we want something to be done. He gives an example. If a small child sees his father lifting a big heavy weight and he wants to copy him, so the small child has no ability to lift a big heavy weight, but he's seen his father do it, so he goes and tries to lift it. But he has no ability to lift it. But the father, having seen that the child wants to lift it, comes from behind him and lifts it up with him, so that the child thinks he's lifting it. So in the same way, we initiate this action because we have the desire to do something. Like the small child desires to copy its father, so therefore it tries, even though it can't do anything. And because it tries, the father is helping, and it happens. So in our case, it's not the father who's helping us. We've got Kṛṣṇa, who is the sanctioner. He's called doer number 3. So we have ourselves, the living entities, as doer number 1 in this section. The second one is the senses. Kṛṣṇa had said it's not us that's working, it's the senses are working. So the second doer is the senses, and the third doer is the super soul. But for us, the Super Soul sanctions our activities, and we have so many demigods in charge of every part of our body, every part of our senses, that they actually do the work for us. There's even a demigod in charge of us opening our eyes and closing our eyes. Whatever we do, there's a demigod who actually helps us to do it. We only desire to do it. So this is elaborately explained a little bit further. And then Kṛṣṇa goes on to say that having come to this true knowledge, then we'll see every living entity the same. In text number 18. Wrong chapter. Vidya Vinaya Sampane Brahmane Gavihastani Suni Chaiva Svapakecha Pandita Samadarshinaha. The humble sages, by virtue of true knowledge, see with equal vision a learned and gentle brahmana, a cow, an elephant, a dog and a dog-eater, an outcast. So this is important because we're trying to help every living entity by spreading Kṛṣṇa consciousness. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur explains in Harinam Chintamani that every living entity is entitled to take up the process of devotional service. So this equal vision is very important for us as devotees as we're trying to spread Kṛṣṇa consciousness everywhere. We have to see that every living entity has the chance to take up Kṛṣṇa consciousness. Bhaktivinoda Thakur goes on to explain that the difference between those who take up and those who don't take up is that a little bit of faith is required. In Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, there's the verse Ado Shraddha Tata Sadhu Sangha Tata Bhajana Kriya. So a little bit of faith is a little bit of inquisitive that there's something more than sense gratification. So once we start this process, anybody has the ability to take it up. Bhaktivinoda Thakur goes on to explain that when we find someone who's envious, as in the 9th offense to the chanting of the holy name, is to instruct an atheist in the glories of the holy name. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur says this is avoided by spreading the holy name, by Sankirtan Yajna, by going out on the streets and Sankirtan. People will hear the holy name and they will start to become purified, and then they will start to develop some faith. So this purification is coming on simply by the process of hearing the holy name. And in doing so, anybody, no matter who they are, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur goes to say even the thieves, rogues and prostitutes can take up the holy name if they become a little bit purified and inquisitive to take shelter of the bona fide spiritual master. So later in the chapter, Kṛṣṇa is still talking about someone who is unattached by the actions of the senses. Person who neither rejoices in achieving something pleasant or laments upon attaining unpleasant, who is intelligent, unbewildered, and who knows the signs of God, is already situated in transcendence. And then he goes on to say they will attain the Supreme very soon. Okay, so I want to stop here and allow some time for questions. Does anyone have any questions today? This sloka. So this summarize the intention of it. So it's talking about a devotee needs to be detached from the senses, pure in consciousness, which leads to detached, purified mind, which leads to purified consciousness. So Prabhupada's explaining in the Purport how when we're in Kṛṣṇa consciousness, then naturally our mind becomes purified. We don't want to engage our senses in anything that's not to do with Kṛṣṇa. So it's talking about Nishkaram karma yoga, which means detached work. But it actually becomes Kṛṣṇa consciousness. The example is given is that in order, at the beginning, Kṛṣṇa had said that Sankhya yoga is non-different from karma yoga. What that means is, although in Sankhya yoga, which is jnana, we have to detach ourselves from our senses, give up sense gratification, and then come to bhakti yoga. But Kṛṣṇa is saying that karma yoga is better because you have to, you simply work on your attachment to Kṛṣṇa. He gives, Burijan Prabhu gives the example that if you have a rock in your hand and you want to pick up a flower, then automatically, if you go to pick up the flower, the rock will be dropped. So in the same way, if we take up this process of Kṛṣṇa consciousness, we don't have to separately put aside the rock and then pick up the flower, because simply by looking for that flower, we'll have to drop the rock. So it means that we act for positive engagement in Kṛṣṇa consciousness, and that automatically we become detached. So that's the conclusion that Kṛṣṇa wants us to lead us to in this chapter. Is that okay? Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Prabhu. Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
yoga-yukto, viśuddha-ātmā, vijita-ātmā, sarva-bhūtātma-bhūtātmā. Anybody who engages devotional service, who is purified soul, who is self-control, who is all the senses of the control, then what is it actually? He is serving the Lord Kṛṣṇa. If he is serving the Lord Kṛṣṇa, everyone is dear to him.
Yeah.
Dear to means he is not having any proudness actually.
Yeah.
He is away from the sense of propriety. He respects each and everybody else, even the demigods also.
Yes.
He is not going to dishonor the demigods also. It doesn't mean that he is serving the Lord Kṛṣṇa and he is calling, oh, I am the devotee of Lord Kṛṣṇa, I have not looked at anybody else. He has to worship the Lord Kṛṣṇa, but he has to respect and honor all the demigods and the devotees also.
Yes.
And that's why actually the demigods and other devotees also, that person is dear to them also. This is the sense of this. So we must say, we must serve the Lord Kṛṣṇa with ardor. We must exhort in the service of Lord Kṛṣṇa without any motive, etc. This is
Yeah. Yes, Krishna is saying that this happens automatically. We desire to serve Krishna. Our consciousness becomes purified, our mind becomes purified, our senses become purified. We are naturally inclined to be kind to all living entities. And because of this, all living entities are also favorable towards us. Thank you, Prabhu. Anything else from anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.